down my burden, down by the riverside, down by the riverside.
Greetings from Wilshire Presbyterian Church. In 1917, 10,000 African Americans descended on New York, and they marched from Fifth Avenue to Madison Avenue. But what made this march so different is that it was dead silent. All you could hear was the rhythmic drums beating as it led the march. So in front of the march, you had a row of drummers beating the drum, and behind them were women and children, all dressed in white. And behind them followed the men and the boys, dressed in black. The woman was dressed in white because for them it symbolizes the innocence amidst the violence and racism of the early 20th century that they were experiencing. And the men were wearing black as the symbolizing their mourning and standing up for their rights. This was the first march in the United States that African Americans undertook, and the first non-violent protest march. And they did it because they were protesting anti-lynching. Just a few weeks before this march in 1917 in July in New York, a horrific thing happened in East St. Louis in Illinois. As race conflicts grew in the city, violence broke out, and a mob of white people for 24 hours burned down African Americans' homes. They would kill any African American that they found, whether it was a man or women or children, old or young, it did not matter. But it wasn't the only reason. For the past 100 years, people were terrorized when you were black, and you were terrorized by lynching. To absolutely fill you with fear and terror every day, afraid to go out your home, not knowing what will happen to you. And it's so interesting that 10,000 people silently and peacefully protesting through the streets of New York stood in stark contrast with just earlier in the year in Waco, Texas, where a mob of 10,000 white people showed up to see an African American young man being lynched. That's what they were doing on the streets that day, hoping that to get the attention of the President Woodrow Wilson so that their livelihood and their rights could be protected. Did Woodrow Wilson hear? Did he do anything? No. In fact, things after that would get much, much worse. By 1919, we have the Red Summer in Chicago, where unimaginable amount of people died. In 1918, a Republican, Leonidas Dyer, did try to get an act through Congress, an anti-lynching act, but it failed in the Senate because the senators from the South voted against it. And it would take another 100 years before we actually had legislation in this country that bans lynching. Yeah, you heard me, 100 years. See, only in 2018 did the Senate pass anti-lynching legislation. And only in February 2020, last year, precisely a year from today, last year, did the House brought forward and voted on the Emmett Till Anti-Lynching Act. 100 years later, that's how long it took us to hear. Not to say that we don't lynch people anymore today, but now we have the act. Shouldn't we have had this act 100 years ago when people were terrified to leave their homes? It is as if we cannot hear as we calls for change and protection and justice and righteousness. We just cannot heed to it. We cannot hear it. Until the 1950s and 60s, lynching was widespread. It was the civil rights movement that changed that. The last recorded lynching happened in 1981 when a young man called Michael Donald was lynched. I wonder how different our country would have looked like today if we heeded that call for justice and protection and just treating people like human beings 100 years ago. I think we would have looked so different. I don't think we would have seen the huge protest, the Black Lives Matter protest of this past summer, because it would not have been needed. But you see, when slavery disappeared, we found a new way to terrorize people. And when we didn't lynch people anymore, we found new ways to terrorize people. And so here we are in 2021. And we live in a deeply divided country. And the thing that always stands out for me is that those who are being oppressed, those who are experiencing violence, are the very people who don't call for vengeance, but are the people who condemn violence and who calls for peace. In the civil rights movement, there were one of the spirituals became one of the anthems, and it's called ain't going to study war no more, or you will know it as Down by the Riverside. And the slave song goes something like this: I'm going to lay down my burden down by the riverside. I ain't studying war no more. I'm going to put on my long white robe down by the riverside. I ain't going to study war no more. And I'm going to talk to the Prince of Peace. And I just can't fathom it, that the very people who were suffering unimaginable hardships at the hands of slave owners, those are the people who came up with this song that says, I ain't gonna study war no more. Where I come from in South Africa, at the end of apartheid, when it was dismantled and Nelson Mandela was released, do you know what white people feared the most? That black Africans would kill them in their sleep. This is how white people think. Well, did that happen? No, of course not. And yet, if we look at my country, where I come from, South Africa's history, the vast majority of violence portrayed were by those in power, white people. And if we look at the history of this country, who portrayed most of the violence? Those in power, us, white people. And yet, if you are black, you better not wear a hoodie. You better not go to buy your Skittles. You don't better be driving. You better don't sleep in your own home. You better don't go jog in any neighborhood, because for some reason you are a horrible threat. And yet the only people, the vast majority of violence portrayed in this country was by those in power. How then is it possible that those who suffer is the ones who call for peace and not for vengeance? It is because this song, this spiritual, is built on a truth that we find in Scripture. It is a truth as old as humankind. It is the truth that God has given to us from the very start, that we have walked this journey with God. So in the book of Isaiah, the prophet Isaiah, he gives us this vision of what the world will look like if we heed the words of God, if we listen later on to the words of Jesus Christ, if we treat people with peace and dignity and kindness. And it comes from chapter 2. Now, the book of Isaiah was written over 300 years. So it gives us a blink or a glimpse into the life of Israel over 300 years. And when the book of Isaiah starts, they're still in Israel. And it's just after the kingdom is split in two. You have a northern and southern kingdom, and there's a lot of division. And then a little bit later, the Syrian Empire is going to come, and they are going to invade the northern kingdom. and they will become part of the Assyrian Empire, and then later the Babylonian Empire will come and they will invade the southern kingdom and they will destroy the temple and they will take people away on exile. You have this constant problem in Israel, is that people enrich themselves and they do it at the cost of the poor and the disenfranchised and the marginalized. And God keeps on saying through the prophets, I'm not interested in your beautiful prayers and your beautiful worship music and how much sacrifices you bring to the temple. Treat the most vulnerable among you better. Take care of the widow and the orphan and the poor. Treat them fairly. But people can't hear this message. So when Isaiah starts his ministry, there's this division between the north and south, and they are attacking one another. And things look very dark. And he says, it's not too late. You can turn around. You can still be unified. This can still change if you follow the teachings of the law. But if you don't, then it's just going to get worse, which is precisely what happened. But Isaiah believed that we can do this. And later on, Jesus is going to believe this too. And so he tells us this is what it looks like when we follow the teachings of the Lord. He writes in chapter 2, verses 2 to 5. In the last days, the mountain on which the Lord's temple stands will become the most important of all mountains. It will be raised above the hills, and people from all nations will come streaming to it. Many nations will come and say, come, let us go to the mountain of the Lord, the temple of the God of Jacob. Then God will teach us God's ways, and we will obey God's teachings. And God's teachings will go out from Jerusalem. The message of the Lord will go out from Jerusalem. He will settle arguments among nations, and he will make decisions for many nations. And they will make their swords into plows and their spears into hooks for trimming trees. Nations will no longer fight other nations, nor will they train for war anymore. Come, O family of Jacob, and let us follow the light of the Lord. So Isaiah said, if you start following the ways of the Lord, then you are following the light, and that light you will then shine. And when people around you see it, they will also want to be part, and everybody would stream to the mountain of God. So instead of invading Israel, instead of invading Judah, instead of taking people away in exile, what will happen is that all the nations will come to learn and worship God, and all nations will have peace. This is the image that Isaiah gives. We have this belief, and it's a fallacy that we have believed as humanity for a very long time, that if we make scientific progress, if we make technological progress, if we make industrial progress, then the world will become a peaceful place, a just place, a better place for everybody to live in. And at the beginning of the 20th century, wide everywhere, everybody has proclaimed, oh my gosh, we are at the beginning of utopia. The world in the 20th century is going to be amazing. Look at all these things that we are developing. Life is going to be fantastic. Yes, that is the century that we killed more people combined in any time in human history that we know of. We had 2 world wars. We had so many genocides. Not just the genocide of the Jewish people where we exterminated 6 million human beings, but across the world. We built atom bombs and released them on people. We just ruined our planet, making it fertile for horrible viruses to develop. So yeah, here we are with a pandemic. That is us. This is the consequences. We're reaping what we have sowed so far, and it is only the beginning. And yet we believe, oh, technology. And yet from the very beginning in Scripture, God teaches us the same message over and over. Progress is measured in how we treat the most vulnerable among us. How we treat the orphan and the widow, the foreigner, the immigrant, the poor, the outsider, the marginalized. How we take care of them, how we lift them up. That is how progress is determined. And it is so counterintuitive of how we think the world works. We think might will fix everything. Hasn't happened yet. We keep on believing this is going to happen this time. But it's more than that. It is this innate greed that we have, where we just take care of ourselves and look out for ourselves and think if we do that, all is going to be fine. And yet every single time that doesn't work out. It's why we had slavery. Pure economics. Can make more money this way. Really, that was the reason for slavery. Greed. It's always coming back to that same evil that we fall trapped for over and over. And yet, Scripture tells us that there is more than enough for everybody. That counter to what we think, if we share, if we put our greed and our selfishness aside, then all of us will prosper. And all of us will then have peace. And it's something that those who struggle and suffer at the hands of others understand. And somehow those in power just don't seem to get it. And so we are going to repeat this pattern over and over and over till we hear it. Not that I want you to be hopeless, because Isaiah and Jesus later believes that this can happen if we only start following the teachings of God. You know, when I talked about earlier and I explained about what happened in East St. Louis in just before the 1917 Silent March, what happened at that time, the Great Migration was happening, and African Americans was moving out from the South to escape the Jim Crow laws to the northern states. And as they move into the states, what business owners did, here comes greed again, is they would hire African Americans at a lower rate and pay them less than white people living in that state. And now you have unhappiness starting to happen. All about the greed. But not only that, they would go one step further. They would take African Americans, pay them less, then they would use them to break the strike line, so that the white workers that were unionizing for a better living and a better wage were cut off by the knees by this. And so who did the white workers get angry at? The African Americans who were taking their jobs. But they were not the problem. Neither of them were the problem. The people making money out of them. That was where the problem lied. And so it always comes back to that. And if we're not going to learn our lesson, we're going to repeat this over and over. In 100 years from now, we will still have protests. And we still will not have justice. And we still will not have equality until we hear and listen to the teachings of God. I was listening to a podcast the other day, and they were talking about the vaccinations. You know, this is unprecedented. It's incredible witness to the human innovativeness and our intelligence and the smarts God gave us, that we could come up with 3-4 vaccines within a year for an absolutely unknown new virus. I mean, that's amazing. And you would go, okay, this is wonderful. This pandemic is going to go over quickly. This is going to be great. We as humans can do anything we put our mind to. Yeah, there's this problem. We get back to the greed thing, the look out for myself thing, and that is where we can derail all of us. See, when it's first started to become clear that we are going to have vaccines and fast, governments could buy and order vaccines from the companies. So guess what happened? Wealthy countries like us, we ordered up all the vaccines. We and the other wealthy countries in the world ordered up vaccines. So to make sure, in fact, we over-ordered. I know it doesn't feel like that right now because it's a slow and we're at the beginning of the rollout, but we ordered more, and not we us, all the European wealthy countries did the same. We ordered more than we would need because we can afford it. So we can take care of our citizens. Okay, good. You remember that little thing I told you about what Scripture tells us, how progress is measured by how we treat those who are at the bottom? Well, here's the problem. That means that most African countries couldn't buy vaccines. They can't even afford them. And they're not the only. So what's going to happen if everybody in America is vaccinated and everybody in Europe is vaccinated, but people in Africa doesn't get vaccinated, and most people in South America doesn't get vaccinated, and most people in poorer East Asian countries doesn't get vaccinated? When the virus there keeps on mutating, then that virus will come back here mutated in such a way that our vaccines will be worthless against it. You see, that's the problem. If everybody of us wants to survive this pandemic, if we want it to be over, then the whole world needs to be vaccinated. In other words, we have to put our selfishness aside and say everybody needs to be vaccinated. And so there's a little bit of a light in the tunnel because some people seem to get this. So AstraZeneca and Harvard that developed the vaccine that we don't have here made a commitment that they will not make any profit in the vaccine that they sell to poorer countries. That's quite impressive. And not only that, the World Organization is asking wealthy countries like us to pay for the vaccines for those countries because even at the base cost price, they can't afford it. That's why we should be part of the World Health Organization. That's why we give money to them so that we can help countries who can't pay for this vaccine. Because if we just look out for ourselves, the consequences will be dire, just as the Israelites figured out as they kept on just looking out for themselves. Because here is a dirty little secret about the exile. I've preached a lot about exile, but there's always one thing I've never told you, is that not everybody in Israel was taken away in exile. When the Babylonians came in and they invaded Israel, they didn't take everybody out in exile. They only took away the well-to-do, the educated, the rich. Those people's lives were disrupted and pulled apart and totally turned over as they were taken away in exile in Babylon. But the poor, the disenfranchised, they stayed behind. In South Africa, we have a saying called Ubuntu. And what it means, if that is one person is suffering, then the whole community will suffer. The wealth of everybody depends on the wealth of everyone. We have to put aside vengeance and greed and selfishness. We have to take care of one another. We have to share. As long as we live with this is mine and not yours, and I am going to keep you down so that I can be on top mentality, we will all suffer. And the world will keep on this cycle of violence over and over and over. And it's all up to us now. We have to make the choice of how we're going to live. Are we going to go to the mountain? Are we going to follow the teachings of God? Or are we going to live and believe the lie the world tells us, that the strongest survive at the cost of the weak? Here is WPC's quartet singing for us Down by the Riverside.
God lay down my burden down by the riverside, down by the riverside, down by the riverside. God lay down my burden down by the riverside to study war no more, war no more. I ain't gonna study war no more, ain't gonna study war no more, ain't gonna study war no more. I ain't gonna study war no more, ain't gonna study war no more, ain't gonna study war no more, war no more. Gonna try on my sword and shield down by the riverside, down by the riverside, down by the riverside. I'm gonna try on my sword and shield down by the riverside to study war no more, war no more. I ain't gonna study war no more, ain't gonna study war no more, ain't gonna study war no more, ain't gonna study war no more. starry crown.
Down by the riverside.
Down
Down by the riverside. Down by the riverside. Gonna try on my starry crown. Down by the riverside.
To study, war no more, war no more.